podcast, produced by CJ Media Solutions. I'm your host, CJ Arlotta. In this episode, I speak with Phil Denning, partner at ICR. During our conversation, Phil shares two frameworks ICR uses when responding to a crisis and provides the details on the firm's COVID-19 microsite. Feel free to send me your feedback at cj@cjmediasolutionsllc.com. Phil can be reached at phil.denning@icrinc.com. Thanks for listening. Phil, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, CJ. Happy to be chatting with you.
So let's first talk a bit about you and your background. You have more than 20 years of experience in public relations. You've advised a wide range of public and private companies on corporate communications, crisis communications, and media relations. How did you get to where you are today?
It's a great question. Actually, I was applying to business school, and one of the guys that I asked to write a recommendation for me ran an investor relations consulting firm. Had no idea what that was, so I always say I backed into the business. I was doing investor relations consulting. He made me a deal. He said, why don't you come to work for me full-time and go to school part-time rather than doing a full-time MBA program. So I wound up going to work as a firm called Keogh White Savage, and I was doing investor relations consulting. So as I would say, I kind of backed into it, and from there went on into continued in consulting for a number of years, then went in-house. I was actually head of investor relations at a company called Kroll, and was there for a number of years. Kroll was then acquired by Marsh & McLennan. Spent a couple of years on a team at Marsh doing kind of change management communications, internally focused versus externally, and then went back to the consulting side, working at a firm called Finsbury, doing more around financial services communications focused and event-driven, around M&A and other types of issues and communications around event-driven activities. And then ultimately to ICR, and I've been at ICR for the last about 8 years.
What's your day-to-day like?
It's a great question. It's very different right now. I would say right now it is during this uncertain periods of uncertainty. It's a lot of time spent on calls, advising and just listening and helping clients think through various scenarios. Wish I had more time to actually dedicate to the writing side of things. So I do spend a lot of the day speaking with clients, helping them think through particular issues. And then the evenings are usually the time to actually sit down and work on documents, and whether it be reviewing or drafting of materials. And then it's kind of rinse and repeat. And during this period of COVID, I think it's not so much what day of the week it is. We joke it's just there's day and then there's night.
Right.
And it starts over.
Yeah. Now, without a doubt, ICR is one of the top PR firms in the country. I think O'Dwyer's has ranked the firm in the top 10 consistently over the years. What should listeners know about ICR and its approach to public relations?
It's a great question. Yeah, so I think that what's been unique and what's really been the secret sauce of ICR, and ICR it used to have for integrated corporate relations, is that integration of investor relations, public relations, digital branding, and the social media, all of the elements of communications being integrated together. But I think really what's been the differentiator is that we do take very much an industry-focused approach. So at ICR, the teams are built out around particular industries. We have cover over 20 industries. So we bring that insight and that knowledge, and knowing not only the nomenclature of a particular industry, but getting to know the reporters that cover that space, and understanding from a trade or from a top tier financial pub, knowing who the reporters are that are covering a particular industry, knowing them very well, but also from the investor relations side, knowing the sell side analysts, knowing the portfolio manager at the buy side shop that actually owns the stock in a particular space. That's really what has been the differentiator for us. is that industry focus, and we do focus our communications. We do everything through the lens of value creation. We work with over 700 companies, most of them being publicly traded, but also private companies, and thinking about it and looking at it through, okay, from a communications perspective, yes, there's a business objective here, but how do we view it from, how does this impact positively or negatively the valuation of a business? So I think that's really been what our kind of secret sauce has been, is that industry focus and really focusing on understanding what's the business objective and how is it going to impact the valuation, and then thinking about how to best communicate based on those metrics.
Now, ICR has clients in numerous verticals. Which sectors are the majority of your clients in, or is it kind of a mix?
Yeah, personally, I oversee a couple of teams. One, is in REITs, and real estate is a big area of concentration for our clients, and then financial services as well as professional services. But across the firm, like I said, we cover 20 different industries. So, with the consumer retail, restaurants, tech, we call better living. So there's pockets of clients, even in the energy space, industrials. So we cover a number of different industries, but personally focus my team on REITs, real estate, financial services, professional services. And then I oversee a team that's more industry agnostic, which is relevant to today's discussion, which is more on the crisis communications and issues management that we call our special situations team.
And what about the firm's crisis communication business? Have you seen an uptick in business with everything going on, or has it remained relatively the same?
It definitely have seen an uptick in activity, spending a lot more time with clients that might be regular clients, whether it be investor relations or public relations, doing ongoing work, but now getting brought in and saying, hey, from dealing with a particular crisis, whether it's dealing with, we need to close down stores, or we have operations that are staying open that are considered essential business, but how do we communicate to those employees, dealing with headcount reductions through layoffs or furloughs or reductions in force. So there's definitely been an uptick in that activity. But I also, on the other side of the house, kind of just from a kind of the types of engagement we're normally involved with, we're also still seeing a lot of activity in shareholder activism. While there's been an overall decline in the number of campaigns so far this year, just with the uncertainty around COVID, we still are seeing a significant number of activist situations in companies that are dealing with activist shareholders. And so that there's definitely been an uptick just in general crisis demands and spending more time with clients dealing with these broader issues.
So let's shift to ICR's strategy for dealing with the crisis. From what I've been told, your firm uses 2 frameworks when responding to a crisis. What's the backstory on those frameworks? Why and how were they developed?
Yeah, good question. So I think one of the things we always say is, like, look, when planning for a crisis, you sit down. If it's a public company, we always say, look, if you look in your SEC disclosures, you've got a whole section based on risk disclosures that you need to make, and say, all right, well, you have to have them in that document. That's a good place to start and say, do we have a communications plan around what if some of those risks do come to be? Do we have a kind of a response plan in place? So you could think about what are potential likely scenarios to come up. But no one thought of a COVID in the world shutting down. So there's always things that kind of come out of nowhere. So my big thing is, I like to say that, look, if you can have some sort of framework to lean back on, it's a lot easier in a situation. So you might not have thought of every scenario, but if we do have a good framework to lean on, that's helpful. So there's 2 that we use. One is that we, in a crisis situation, that we call fear. And we take a little bit of poetic license with the spelling of it. But the number one is, so the F is the facts. When you're dealing with a crisis, you want to make sure that you're communicating the facts. We had 2 E's in there, 2 A's. So the E is the empathy. You always want to make sure that you have thinking about your communications, you have a duty to communicate, but you also have to recognize that as a company that you're dealing with people that in a crisis situation that may have been negatively impacted. So making sure that there's appropriate level of empathy in any of your communications. The first A is action. You want to make sure that you're taking action. And a lot of times you may not have, going back to the F, you may not have all the facts, and rather than sitting around and waiting and making sure you have 100% of the information, we say that you want to be able to communicate around the process. What steps are you taking to be able to identify all the facts? So that's the first A. And then the second A is accountability. I think in crisis communications, when there is something that has gone wrong, taking accountability for it is important. And people want to know that you are the other A, taking action, not only accountable, but also responding to it. And then the R in our fear framework is the recovery. Thinking about, okay, now that we are getting back, we've through a crisis, there's now getting back onto your front foot and how being proactive from a communications perspective. And that recovery part of it is talking about what you've done, what steps have been taken to hopefully avoid that event happening again. So if it's something that was within the control of the business, what have we changed from a business practice and policy perspective so that we hopefully will not have a similar issue come up again? So again, it's what are the facts, you have an appropriate level of empathy in your communication. You want to talk about the actions that you're taking. So you might not have all the information at that point, but you are taking steps to address it. And then taking accountability and saying, okay, now that we've recognized what the issue was, what caused the problem, what are we doing then to recover and get back onto our front foot? And that is the R. So that's the first framework called fear.
Hey, Phil, before we get into the second framework, I just had a question on the first one. You talked about the facts and action, and sometimes you don't always have the facts, and that's fine. You have to just kind of let people know that you are taking action and this is what you're doing. But how long should you wait for those facts to come in to kind of make a decision to act and inform your stakeholders of what's going on?
Yeah, no, the speed of response is critical, because, if you're not out there communicating, somebody is, particularly in a crisis situation. So I think as quickly as possible, getting out and saying that, recognizing that there's something that is an event that has occurred, there is something that's ongoing, and say that we are continuing to isolate the incident and identify the facts and be able to have an answer to particular questions. So I think getting out there as quick as possible is key. And then that's where you'd say, well, why don't we wait until we have all the answers? The reason that you can't wait is that somebody else, while you're waiting to get a particular number tied down or whatever the case is, somebody is already out there tweeting about it or posting about it or talking about it, and whether it's internally or externally. And so if you're not quickly speaking about it and saying, hey, look, we recognize there's an issue, something happened, we don't have all the answers right now, we'll come back to you once we do, but in the interim, we are taking these following steps to identify the information. So that's what we typically do.
Yeah, and your stakeholders appreciate that, right? They understand that you may not have all the facts right now, but you're doing your best to kind of get those facts together and find out what exactly is going on.
I think so. I mean, I think that, people want to know. I mean, it is immediately. Of course, that's the kind of the reality of the world today. Whether it's a reporter or it's a shareholder or it's an employee, they want to know what happened and what caused it. What are we doing about it? We don't, unfortunately, have pure and full information when it does occur. So it is a bit of a balancing act, which is, there might be some level of frustration with particular, different stakeholder groups because we don't have all the answers right away. But I think that over time, what people do realize is that when the dust settles, is that, hey, look, we know that they weren't hiding under their desks when things were going wrong. They were out there. They were publicly facing and saying, hey, yeah, we recognize there was an issue. We're taking action. And as soon as we do have all the answers, we'll provide as much detail as we can.
And now the second framework, you're using both of these frameworks, correct? It's not one or the other.
Yeah. Correct. So the second one actually was one that I learned in business school, which is called MapSeek, which I could take credit for creating either one of them, but they're not my work product, but I found them to be very helpful in the work that we do, and I think MapSeek is one that actually I taught a course on crisis communications at Fordham University, and spent a lot of time talking about this framework. And so the MapSeek is MAPSIQ. So it's, what are the messages that we need to be communicating? Who are the audiences that we need to be reaching, informing, and influencing? What is the purpose of communications? What's our objective? What are we trying to achieve? The S is the situation. Let's think of now, okay, think of not only what situation are we in as a management team that needs to communicate, but also the situation of the audiences that we're trying to communicate to. The I is the introduction, which is kind of, okay, you talk about an elevator pitch. How do we boil it down and say, this is what, if I'm about to take the stage or someone's going to introduce this issue, what do we want them to say? So how do we kind of boil it down to that brief introduction? And then the Q is what are the questions? What are the questions that someone's likely going to have? And think about, okay, which things are we going to be able to proactively address through our prepared remarks or statements? Or what are the questions that, hey, we don't have necessarily full information on, but we should be prepared to have a response knowing that it's likely to come up. So that's the second framework, which is MapSeek. And I think that it's useful in any sort of communications challenge. If you can sit down and think through it and say, what do we want to get across? Put ourselves in the seat of the audience that we're trying to reach and understand how they're feeling. And then really boil it down to what is at the essence of what we want them to take away from a message perspective. What is it that we want them to know? And I think that kind of is very helpful in any communications challenge, but in particularly when you have a crisis that you're trying to manage through.
Now, when you're taking a look at the message and the audience portion of it, your stakeholders, you really have like an overall message, correct? And you're really kind of just tweaking it a bit for those stakeholders.
Correct. I think one of the biggest things that we say is that you need to be consistent across all stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So while there's going to be some level of customization, so something that may be more important and relevant to a shareholder may be less relevant to an employee, and vice versa. But I think that at the core of it, it's whatever the particular event is that it's occurred, you want to be consistent in your messaging, and then there's you'll probably be adding or tweaking or adjusting certain levels of detail for a particular audience or a stakeholder group.
Mm. Now, what about the questions portion? How do you go about doing that? Do you work with a team that sits down and tries to come up with a lot of the questions that internal stakeholders may have or external stakeholders may have?
Correct. So fortunate to have a great team that I work with, and then in particular, if it's a client that's in a particular industry, we have the ability to lean on some very smart people that are very deep in a particular space, or are going to know a particular company or their stakeholders very well. So the way we typically start is we're going to start by breaking down by the stakeholder groups and say, okay, great. So there's the internal, the external, and then there are a lot of subgroups within that. Breaking it down and then going through it that way is the way that we approach it. And a lot of times it's you're going to start with if it's a publicly traded company, shareholders are going to be, a big audience, internal, the employees, then you're kind of getting into, depending on what the event is it something that's going to matter to our creditors or to our lenders? Is it something that's going to matter to our retirees? Is it something that's now do we have a union issue? So breaking down all those groups, so laying out that stakeholder map, and then that's the best way then as a team and say, okay, great. Let's think about, you're the expert from a shareholder perspective. You think about it from that lens. What do you think is going to be most important? Okay, you're going to focus on the employees. You're going to focus on our lenders or creditors, et cetera. So we try to break it down from the team perspective and then be able to share, come up with a master list of questions.
So let's say a small business owner tries to implement the two frameworks you've just provided. Which components are they going to probably struggle with the most, and how can they overcome them?
I think the biggest challenge we find, particularly in a crisis situation, is the particularly a smaller business. You're playing many different roles. Larger companies are going to have multiple team members, and you can bring on different experts. You can have your own internal communications, your own internal legal, your own HR. That you can lean on those people. Smaller businesses, you tend to have, wear multiple hats. And it might be costly to bring in external people. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just sitting down and saying, okay, when you're, a one-man band, it's a challenge to be able to, number one, generate all the thinking that you need, and generating all the content that you're going to need. But number two is then being able to have somebody that is kind of, lack of a better term, dispassionate, is not involved in the day-to-day, and be able to step back and look at it and say, okay, that's, I think, very valuable to whatever size business is, having that third party be able to look at it. And I think that, using where I think that the biggest challenge would be from using the frameworks is, when the sphere one is really kind of stepping back and taking the focus and focusing on the action that you're taking, talking about that. You're probably going to be looking and saying, how do I get to the answer right away? And you don't necessarily be able to get there right away. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge in that framework. Then within MapSeek, I think it's really on the question side, being able to step back and say, okay, what are the likely questions from all the different stakeholder groups, to be able to put that down in one place, I think is, a little bit more challenging for a small business owner. You might have a smaller group of stakeholders, but you might not be thinking about all of them right away.
Yeah, and as you're aware, sometimes business owners aren't prepared for crises. So if they're already in crisis, what should they do? Any tips for them?
I think the biggest thing is, recognize that you're not going to be able to answer everybody's questions right away. And I think that number two is that it might be a crisis, and they range from the level of severity, but the response should be commensurate with the issue. When you are in the eye of the storm, every tweet or negative article or anything that comes out becomes very personal. But what you need to then do is step back and look and say, okay, is this somebody that's posting and they have 5 followers, and it's just not really, really getting a lot of traction.
Right.
So you need to be able to look and say, okay, is this something that's really occurring in a small subset, and that's how we should adjust or, kind of develop our communications plan? Or is it something that is truly, larger in scale and scope, of which require a larger, more, aggressive response? So I think that's one of the things that we see, that when somebody is in a crisis mode, everything is much more heightened. So that ability to step back and say, okay, great, this might be something that's very personal to you, but is it really resonating outside of a small group? And if not, let's make sure our response is appropriate. And if it is, also let's make sure that we're more aggressive and more, from a response standpoint, getting out there much more visibly.
Now, to help businesses who are responding to the COVID-19 crisis, I know ICR rolled out an entire library of insights and resources on its website. How should small businesses go about implementing that content?
It's a great point. I would definitely recommend your listeners to go to icrinc.com and take a look. We have a whole section dedicated to responding to a lot of things that we're seeing just across our client base. And I think that's one of the great things about ICR, is we just see so much with the number of clients that we have. So I think it's really, when somebody is dealing with an issue, your first response is you want to get insight and you want to get additional intelligence. And I think that's how you could use the microsite that we've developed around COVID-19. It lets you know, like, okay, look, you're not the only one that's dealing with this. There are a number of companies dealing with the same issue, whether it's you have to pull your guidance, or you're dealing with furloughing employees, or you're dealing with a shareholder activist, or whatever the issue is. There's probably other companies that are dealing with it. So reading and going to our microsite, you can get a good sense as to what are some of the issues, and then some thoughts around how you begin to respond. And then I think, relying, whether it's ICR or your internal team, using that as a starting point is a great way to start to lay out a game plan. So, highly recommend it. I think it's a great resource, and is, blown away by the amount of content that our team has been able to generate, and the amount of information that we're seeing just from across our client base, and the ability to share it is tremendous.
Phil, those are all the questions I have for you today. I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I'll talk with you soon.
Excellent. I appreciate it, TJ. Take care.